weekly segment with Michael Rebman from the Artesia Historical Museum and Art Center. Michael, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Hope things are going well. Are you staying cool?
Oh, yes, we're staying quite comfortable here. We have to keep the temperatures down because that helps with the preservation of artifacts. If it's too hot, wood and other natural materials deteriorate quite quickly.
No question about that.
Comfortable.
Yeah, so it's comfortable for the folks that work there. It's comfortable for the artifacts, and of course, it's comfortable for the visitors that come by to see the different items that are on display. So that's good. Hey, we've been talking about militias and other parts of our past history. You want to talk about volunteers today, and so we're going back to the 1840s when we determined 50 years or so after the founding of the country, before the Civil War, and we had militias, but we also had volunteers at that time?
Yes, volunteers, that was a somewhat new thing. As I said last week, the militias did not really work out in the War of 1812. And the United States did not want to expand the regular army again. They did that for the War of 1812, but Congress didn't really like the idea of having a lot of soldiers permanently full-time in the army. So they came up with a new idea for the Mexican War of 1846. They would give each state a quota for how many soldiers they were supposed to supply. But they did not give specific rules as to how the states would find those soldiers. So of course, War of 1812, they were told to call out the militia, bring out so many militiamen. They changed it to bring out volunteers. Hire volunteers, short-term volunteers. Now, when we say the volunteer army, with the United States today, it's all volunteer.
Right.
People who join the army join because they want to. I don't think we even do I don't think judges even sentence people to join the army anymore. I think that went out of favor.
Right, and I don't even know if they're still doing selective service, but still, yes, it's all volunteer service right now.
But back in the 1840s and 1860s, the volunteer concept was different. Of course, the regular army at the time was mostly voluntary as well. People chose to join the army, although sometimes it was less than voluntary if they were sort of waylaid and kind of forced into joining, or if they were trying to avoid debts or anything like that, they would change their name and join the army and be sent out to California. But they had a separate category of soldiers, the volunteers. They were people who joined a state's organized units for a short duration. For the Mexican War, they first started with 3-month enlistments because everybody thought that the war would only last 3 months, which was kind of silly to think about, that you could call out the entire army, send them all to Mexico, and send them back home again after fighting in just 3 months.
Yeah.
And that, of course, did not work out at all, and General Scott, who was in charge of the army, of course, told them that. That led to some feuding between him and President Polk, and Scott was almost fired because of it. But he managed to convince them to change the enlistment terms to 1-year enlistment terms, so that way they could actually train people. But the way it worked was the states would call out people to join. Some states also called out their militia and tried to fill their quotas by forcing the militia to go off to Mexico, which most militia soldiers did not like that idea.
Well, you mentioned that previously the militias were the problems that came in previous with using calling up the militias was that the militias felt that their only obligation was for the state that they were in. So did the volunteer, when you signed up or volunteered to be a part of the Army, was that part of the language that they included in your sign-up document? Was that you would go wherever you were told to go?
Well, with the volunteers, yes, sort of. They were told, of course, that they signed up to serve in a volunteer regiment for the duration of the war or the duration of their enlistment, whichever one was shorter.
Okay.
So, like, for example, in New Mexico, the volunteers who came out this way were from Missouri. And there was a battalion of Mormon volunteers who were chased out of Missouri by the militia. That's another... That in itself is a fascinating story.
Yeah.
A horrifying story, too, because the militias there actually physically chased them out, burned their houses, and killed quite a few of them.
Mm.
But that's a different war from the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. But the volunteers, they signed up knowing that they were going to fight in the war. They signed up for one-year enlistments. So when General Kearny first invaded New Mexico in 1846, he brought with him a regiment of Missouri volunteers. He brought with the 1st Dragoons and a handful of other volunteers and other smaller units. And because they signed up for a one-year enlistment, they fought in New Mexico, and then they eventually found their way back to Missouri, where they were disbanded, even though the war was going on.
Right.
So the volunteers, they had their own problems during the Mexican War, because they, like with the militias, they saw themselves as being citizens first and soldiers second.
Mm.
So they didn't like to follow rules and regulations when they were fighting in New Mexico. The Missouri mounted riflemen did not want to wear uniforms. They did not want to wear their coats. And there was a lot of controversy down in Mexico over that as well, especially when their original uniforms wore out and the volunteers did not want to wear the uniforms that the U.S. Army was going to give them. They had the same sort of situation, less so during the Civil War, because as well they had volunteers then. The states were given quotas for how many volunteers they had to find. Some states continued to provide uniforms for their soldiers, but for the most part, the U.S. Army eventually gave them uniforms. The way that worked, too, is that they formed the volunteer units. They were state volunteer units, but they were inducted into the U.S. Army when the regiment was finally accepted for national service. So they had weapons, uniforms, arms provided by the United States after their state-issued gear wore out.
Interesting in all of that. So, did it work? I mean, did it improve the command structure? Were they a more cohesive unit after these changes?
Yes and no. It was complex. It was a complex situation. It worked to a certain extent, and it didn't work to a certain extent. Like, there's like unit cohesion. There was a lot of issues with cohesion as the regiments wore down, especially during the Civil War. As the regiments wore down, they brought in new recruits, but the United States became desperate to find a new recruit. So starting in 1862, they really aggressively offered bounties for joining. Certain states would offer a certain number of hundreds of dollars for enlisting. Others would offer like $100 with or $200, depending on the states, with a 25% cash advance on enlistment. So you join, you get paid $25 cash up front, and then when your enlistment ends, you get an additional $75, or however much the bounty was. So they had to get aggressive with trying to recruit, especially because the militias did not. There are fewer militias, and they were all voluntary militias in 1861, and some of them joined, some of them didn't, and some of them opted to join the volunteer regiments instead of joining the militia regiments being sent off to battle.
And what was the primary difference, structural difference between the militia and the volunteer again at this point? Because why would somebody consider one or the other?
Well, the militias, by 1861, the militias, they were pre-existing units, privately run and operated, but answering to the states because compulsory militia service had been ended in the 1840s. So they were, especially in the cities, they were more like fraternities.
Okay.
Some of them were like, you had the Washington Artillery, a fraternity that paid a lot of money to buy cannons. Then you had others that were just infantry, and during the 1840s, 1850s, there were a lot of volunteer militia units that gave up their weapons altogether and became firefighting groups. But they were very much a sort of fraternal bonding sort of organization.
Okay.
It was where people who had ties, whether they were economic ties, like the wealthy citizens of a town would put on their fancy uniforms and parade around, or they were ethnic ties, like all the people of German descent in a county would form a militia unit. The volunteers, they were brand new units that formed for very short periods of time. So like the Washington Artillery existed for decades. The first New Mexico Volunteers was formed for a short duration. The state was given the task, or the territory was given the task of finding so many thousands of soldiers. So the territory appointed officers and told the officers to recruit soldiers.
But the soldiers that would join that, the volunteer regiments, were probably more, I'm going to do this for the year, or whatever the length of the service time was, and then I'll be done with it. Whereas the militias, people tended to stick with the militias or stay with the militias for longer periods of time?
Precisely. The people in the militias would be in the militias before the war and after the war. The volunteers were pretty much just ordinary citizens who joined the Army, except when they didn't voluntarily join. Because by 1863, they were so desperate for numbers that they instituted a draft.
Right. And that was that the first draft then?
Well, technically, everybody had to serve during the War of 1812, but they didn't. So it wasn't really the first time the United States did conscription, but it did set up a system for conscription because the military districts throughout the North, they were given quotas for how many specific soldiers they had to recruit. They had to enroll everybody in the first class between the ages of 20 and 35, in the second class between 35 and 45, and everybody had to sign up. And then they gave out exemptions based upon certain conditions, like whether or not someone was a widower who was taking care of children, whether someone was the sole child of elderly, infirm people, and so on. There are no exemptions for religion.
Right. So it was more of economic exemptions.
Exactly. And so if the military district did not have enough soldiers voluntarily signing up, they could start calling upon people and telling them to sign up, and they'd go alphabetically. If someone was wealthy, they could hire a replacement. But otherwise, they had to show up and serve.
You could hire a replacement. Here's Bob and $100. He's serving for me.
Exactly.
Wow.
And of course, that did lead to a lot of unit cohesion issues as well. The sort of social cohesion issues. Not so much like their function in battle, but There's definitely sort of a social class, social standing situation in the volunteer regiments. The people who signed up in 1861, they were the patriots. They were the best of the volunteers. Everybody in the newspapers, all the newspaper editors loved them. Those who started signing up in 1863 were the people seeking the bounties. They were mercenaries. The newspaper editors did not like them. The soldiers who signed up in 1861 did not like them. And finally, by 64, you start seeing draftees. They were like 10% of the U.S. Army overall.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody hated them because they were forced to join. They did not willingly join. They weren't patriotic.
Right.
And so they were despised by their fellow soldiers.
I could see that. That would be the case. My gosh, interesting stuff. Michael, we've got about a minute and a half left. Was there anything else on the volunteers that you wanted to mention before we remind everybody of your exhibit?
Well, the volunteers, they were an interesting. It was an interesting aspect of U.S. history because everybody still thought that you didn't need a standing army. That in times of emergency, you could call up the militia. That didn't work. You call up everybody to voluntarily fight, and that didn't work. And so finally, after the Civil War, they realized they need a larger army.
Mm-hmm.
And they finally begrudgingly paid for a larger army, although Congress kept on trying to cut the Army's budgets and finally forced them to cut back to just 25 regiments of infantry. But that really showed that you need actual professional soldiers. And so that's how the United States Army got to be where it is today. Professional soldiers.
Professional soldiers, that's right. If you want to do it right and be successful, that's kind of the direction you have to go. You do have an exhibit in place right now, the men's clothing from the 1905 era?
Yes, the fashionable founding fathers, menswear of 1905. It's on display in the Art Center. Be sure to visit the old house first, sign the guest book, and we are open 10 to 1, 2 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday.
Very good. Hope folks get a chance to come by and visit with you and check that out. Michael, always enjoy our conversation and look forward to